I'm excited to introduce you to today's session entitled So You've Heard About Podcasts. This is a very timely topic as podcast is becoming a significant portion of many of our lives as a way of knowing and being informed about the world. I'll confess, I start my days mostly with podcast to learn about news. So our speakers, Kelly Jones and Emily Gadek, are experienced podcast producers and have graciously agreed to share their expertise with all of us today. Kelly Jones is a freelance producer and editor currently working on Seizing Freedom from Virginia Public Media and Stitcher. She helps UVA students produce documentaries for the RRD Lab. And Emily Gadek spends her time producing Sacred and Profane, the RRD Lab podcast, exploring the many ways religion shapes our daily lives. So with that, I will turn it over to Kelly and Emily.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. We're excited to be here. And because we're huge nerds, we're excited to talk to you about podcasts. I think go ahead, Kelly.
Everybody's turning their cameras off because they don't want to be recorded. If you feel like it and want to turn them back on, it's always easier to talk at people's faces. No pressure. If you don't, I'll just talk to Emily's face. And if you don't mind, one thing that we would love for you to do sort of while we're getting started is to just type in what department you're from and what podcasts you listen to, if any, into the chat so that we can see them. We're really curious about who listens to what and why, and whether any of them are actually sort of quote unquote academic podcasts, because a lot of them exist. And so we'd like to talk to you about them.
Zoom will let you turn the no worries about the cameras on. But yeah, if you guys can just drop that in the chat, just let us know your department and if you have a favorite podcast.
Yeah. Emily, do you want to talk a little bit more about your background, and then I'll talk about mine, and we can segue into why academics are the best podcast producers?
Absolutely. So Kelly and I we met. We both worked on a podcast called Backstory that was actually produced at UVA with a focus on American history that was hosted by anywhere from 3 to 4 professors of history. So my background personally is, I was a freelancer before I came here. I've worked on projects about all sorts of things from immigration station on Angel Island here in the San Francisco Bay Area where I'm based right now, to Supreme Court justices falling in rivers. And now I work for the religion department, and I help out with the student documentary program, as well as producing Sacred and Profane, which is a show about how religion affects all sorts of things in our daily lives. We've done stories on everything from Hare Krishna group out in West Virginia that is wrestling with whether to allow fracking on their land, to why the ancient Persian King Cyrus has become such a popular figure in evangelical Christian America. Turn it over to Kelly.
A really good episode. You should check that one out. So as Emily said, I met her when we both started producing Backstory around the same time many years ago. And I'm a recovering PhD student. So I was getting my PhD in philosophy, and I did all of my coursework, and I was like, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. Like, I get paid to teach and to write and to go to class with all of my friends, and then my coursework was over and they were like, cool, go write a book, we'll see you in 5 years. And I got really lonely. And it turned out that the thing that I loved about graduate school was like talking about big ideas with a bunch of people who also love to talk about big ideas. Spoiler alert, I quit my PhD because there wasn't enough of that and turned to journalism and audio documentary making so that I could hold on to that kernel of talking to people about big ideas who are also interested in big ideas. So it came to Backstory after that. And in my cover letter, I think I wrote something about why like my research skills in grad school were going to be the thing that were going to help me become an amazing podcast producer. And probably I made a lot of it up, but actually it ended up being true. So I'm going to talk about that in a second. From there, I've freelanced and moonlighted for NPR and the BBC, and now I am working on a podcast, as E said, called Seizing Freedom. It is the story of how African Americans took their own freedom during the Civil War and then transformed it into the freedom they wanted to see during Reconstruction. And in order to do that show, we can't interview anyone who was alive then, obviously. So I spend most of my days combing through Library of Congress archives, translating documents from the 1860s and 70s into stuff that we can understand today, reading a ton of secondary sources, and basically just like becoming an expert in American Reconstruction as quickly as possible, and using those archives paired with voice actors to then make a documentary about what that time period looked like on the ground. And so if that work sounds familiar, it's because I'm sure like a lot of you do that anyway. And it's just a really natural progression from telling the kinds of stories that you tell in your research to telling audio stories. It is a different medium and there's a whole lot of art to it, but at the end of the day, it's kind of all writing, and that's a blessing because you already know how to do that. So like I said, you know how to do most of this stuff, and maybe it's a little bit intriguing to you. You want to know how it gets made, and maybe that's why you're here. Emily and I are going to talk a little bit more about why you should be excited about it and how you already have these skills. And then we're going to play you 2 examples from graduate students that we worked with at the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab. I think 2 years ago, we worked with them on these projects, and they're absolutely stellar. I mean, they're the kind of thing that you turn on NPR One, their podcast app, and you would hear these. They're sound designed, they're well produced, they involve deep research and interviews. And we just wanted to share them with you and tell you a little bit about how they got made, and then maybe you would be intrigued to come and make one with us about your research. So one thing that I really like that I'd probably put in my old backstory cover letter about why academia sort of qualified me to be a journalist, even though I hadn't gone to journalism school, is that thing about wrestling with really complex ideas. So it's not hard to convince a PhD student or plus about how 2 maybe incommensurate ideas can fit together. You just have to go and find the receipts. And in audio production, you just have to find those receipts and then get them on tape in a really compelling way that makes people want to listen to it. Maybe you speak multiple languages. Maybe you had to do that to get into a program. That can be really useful because it can expand the kinds of storytelling you're allowed to do as a journalist. Emily's going to play a piece by someone who's fluent in both English and Spanish, and that just opened up the world of possibility for the lab about what kinds of stories she was able to tell. Probably you're a quick writer. Probably you don't talk about how you're a quick writer because maybe you write things at the last minute, and actually that's okay. But drafting and redrafting is something that happens all the time in the work that we do. It's tricky. I see a lot of podcasts in the chat, and it makes me really happy that everybody listens to podcasts for the most part. But they don't just appear. Some of them do. The 4-hour-long, like, horrible QAnon podcasts just appear because they don't edit them and they don't think about what they want to say before they say it. The stuff that we do is much more documentarian. So we write a script, we rewrite a script, we get feedback, we take notes, there are revisions, there's 2nd drafts, 3rd drafts, 4th drafts. Sometimes you write a script and it reads really well, but it doesn't sound very good. So your last draft is actually throwing the script out and just saying the thing that you know really well. Like I said earlier, this is a really heavy writing process. So you already have those skills. That's good. Probably you have skills, for better or worse, I'm still working on this, of taking feedback and incorporating feedback and not taking it personally, maybe. Definitely still working on that last part, but that's a big part of this process. As a journalist, you will have an editor, and the best editors are with you from the beginning. It's really like having a research partner. You know, they want your story to sing. They want it to be the best it could possibly be. I was very grateful for that when I sort of moved over from academia to podcasting. And you're probably amazing at solving problems, conceptual problems, and that's going to happen a lot as you go to make a podcast or an audio documentary. Sometimes people will say, in response to an interview request, I really want to do this. This sounds like such a worthwhile project. I'm on leave and good about setting boundaries, so get back to me in 6 months. But your deadline is in 2 weeks. What do? You're going to have to figure it out. And there's a lot of different creative ways to solve that problem. There's different kinds of people you can talk to that aren't just academic experts. And quick writing and quick problem solving skills, I think, are two of the best indicators that it's very easy to move from academia to podcasting. So that's my speech about like why you're kind of already doing this and you just really need a microphone and then you'll be golden.
And I am, ironically, as someone who's never been a PhD program, going to talk about how we think this work, like working in radio production and documentary production, is actually going to be really useful to your own research. The first obvious thing is like if you're going out to report a story, like interacting with people, that can really enhance what you're working on. Kelly mentioned, right, sometimes you're going to call people and they'll be on leave and they'll set good boundaries and they won't call you back, but you will be surprised by how many people who are a big deal in your field will be very excited to talk to you about a project if they think it's interesting. Our job for 4 years was cold calling historians, and you would not believe the Pulitzer Prize winners who get back to you to talk about something that they're excited about. The other thing that Kelly sort of touched on is this idea of turning big questions and themes into a story. So that's really helpful in terms of a skill that you can import into making a documentary. But we found from talking to students who've gone through our documentary program that it's also really helpful in writing a thesis project. So really often, I know this is true when I'm making a story, I come at it with like a huge bundle of just facts and things and people I find so interesting, and they're all awesome. And there's no way that they all fit together into one cohesive story. And so, a big part of making a documentary is the cutting room floor and figuring out what is truly important, like the point that you really want to make, like why this thing is so exciting to you is going to help you figure out on some level what question you're trying to answer with your piece and with your research. It's also really wonderful, as you're writing a thesis that hopefully turns into a book that hopefully has a life in the public square in some way, to practice writing not just for the eye, but for the ear. So a way to make your research really compelling to people outside your field, is to write it as though you're gonna have a cocktail conversation with somebody. And that is what you're doing when you're making a documentary piece. So you're not dumbing down your ideas, but you're finding a way to express things just in a way that is going to let your passion and your knowledge of this shine through, but also hopefully would be understandable to somebody who does not have your level of knowledge in the field. And it gets your work in the public eye, of course, fingers crossed. So we have students who have gone on to have their work featured in various ways, either by having their pieces played on local radio, being invited to write about the topic that they've done as a podcast for a national outlet. So it can be a stepping stone to getting your work in the public eye, which is always wonderful. And I think the last thing is students have really told us that the process has made their research stronger because it forces them to edit down to the real question. So it's just such a long process, I think, making a thesis or a book. And the thing that is really nice about radio, the sort of structure of it is like, basically you are branching out and returning to the same to the same general theme or the same general question. And it really forces you to refine it. I think a thing that is also great and changing about journalism right now is it allows you to have that question and that theme and also have a point of view. As long as you have the research and the receipts to back up what you're saying, we trust your expertise as a narrator to tell us, this side, is doing X and this side is doing Y. A lot of journalism has suffered for decades, I think, from this this idea of like false objectivity, which we see has had disastrous consequences in all kinds of things, right? From climate change, right? Presenting both sides of research as being equally valid, to pretty much everything that happened in the Trump administration, and questions of racial justice for many, many decades. If you go back and look at reports of lynchings in the New York Times, you know, in the early 20th and late 19th century, it's presented as sort of this both sides story. And that's, you know, as you know from your own research, there's not always two sides to a story. Yeah, so I think from there, what we'll do is dive into two case studies from two of our student documentarians. I'll let Kelly take the first one, I'll take the second. They are both really interesting stories about very different things, and I'll let Kelly explain what our first sample will be.
Yeah. And I'd encourage you to, at any time that we say something that doesn't make sense, please throw your question in the chat. We're going to have a Q&A session at the very end, but if you're microphone shy or camera shy and you want to just put it in the chat, we can try to address it too before we get there. So this piece that I'm going to play, speaking of two sides, and having a point of view, this was made by Kevin, who's a graduate student in religious studies, and his expertise was and is in evangelicals and climate change and the environment. And so he discovered this evangelical summer camp, and he was like, oh, that's so great. Like, they take college kids, high school and college kids, and give them, you know, an education in being an evangelical Christian who's concerned about environmentalism. Maybe I'll just pop up there, see what's happening. That is not the full story, but I am going to stop telling you the story and have you just listen to the first 2 minutes, and then I'll fill you in on the back end. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully share my audio, and hopefully it will work seamlessly, but since we've been doing Zoom for a year, we know that's not always the case, so just a second. Okay, hopefully you can see that. And this piece is called Sticky Situation. Here's the first 2 minutes.
Smush it!
It's a typically busy weekday morning at Ensemble Institute for Environmental Studies.
I don't want to squish him, you squish him.
You squish him, we got the gloves.
Students from Christian colleges around the country are buzzing around this camp in northern Michigan, packing mosquito nets and scientific instruments into big vans as they get ready for ecology classes out in the woods and wetlands around the camp.
Hey, my name is Emily, and this class is Field Techniques in Wetlands, so that basically means we go stand in water, and we look at some trees, and we look at some dirt, and we say, oh yes, this is in fact a wetland.
For Emily and the few dozen other college students taking summer classes with her, Ensemble offers a chance to complete some science credit hours while exploring the connection between their faith and the environment. The technical term for this kind of place would be a biological field station, but it's one that's set aside specifically for evangelical college kids.
I grew up trying to install recycling programs at my elementary school. Like, it started at a very young age, and it's always been very intricately tied into my Christian faith, which is really cool coming to Ensemble and kind of getting my first glimpse of what a broader environmental Christian community looks like.
From the outside, Ensemble looks like a pretty typical summer camp. There's a dining hall, a few cabins for campers, and a lodge for evening social events. Everything's surrounded by these dense, tall pines so that you can't always see the next building over, even if it's a stone's throw away. But over the last few decades, Ensemble has come to serve as something much more than a summer camp.
It's been amazing. You have so much in common with everybody. Just everybody's on the same page, and we're all super excited about the environment.
Today, you could call Ensemble a crown jewel for evangelical Christian ecology. Students from the major evangelical colleges around the country come here each summer to explore the link between their faith and the environment. What those students don't immediately know, and what Ensemble's founders couldn't have predicted back when they started it, was that there was something else bubbling beneath the surface that would link faith and the environment in a more complicated way. One of the most productive oil supplies in the region was right under their feet.
stop the screen share. There we go. Okay. So those are the first 2 minutes of the story. It continues in that not only is Ensemble Evangelical environmental summer camp extravaganza situated on an oil well, all of the money that they take in order to make that camp a reality comes from oil money. So in the 70s, when they founded the camp, an oil company came to them and said, hey, you're on this land, like, can you sell us the land or sell us the oil? And they were like, yes. And they made so much money. And it's a bunch of money that keeps the camp running. And so the rest of the piece is like, how do you have an organization that gets its funding that seems, on the surface, really contradictory to its mission? And then there's this added layer of being evangelical. So Kevin spoke to a lot of the administrators, and they have, since the 70s, found some really interesting ways to justify taking oil money to make an environmentalism camp. Everything from the guy that's like, well, it doesn't really matter what we do. We have to make individual choices. I mean, like, I ride my bike all the time, so that probably cancels out the oil that we're selling. To other people who are like, well, God put the land here, and then he put the oil here, and then he put us here. So if he didn't want us to have it, he wouldn't have put it there. So it's ours. We have it. To someone who's like, I mean, it's all really complicated. I'm not really sure. I haven't sorted it out yet. We planted a bunch of trees to like make up for the fact that we were destroying the land, except the trees aren't growing, so it's like very complicated for her. And then the sort of big reveal at the end is that the students don't know this until the very last day that they're at the camp. And then they just sort of slip it into the curriculum and say goodbye. So before he went to go visit, Kevin knew about the oil. He knew about the environmental camp, but he didn't know much else. And so his investigation really was like, how do they talk about this thing that seems like it doesn't match? How do they justify where they get their funding and still say that they are environmental evangelicals? What is that like? And so it's not the kind of like gotcha piece that you might assume that it is. He really did go and hear from as many different people as he could about their reasoning. And so he had a point of view that this is absolutely insane, and there's no reason why this environmentalism camp should be running based on oil money. But he let people tell their stories. And so the next, 16 minutes is like, all right, let's sort through this. Let's figure it out. What's ethical? What's unethical? By the end of the piece, you don't have one concrete answer, but you've heard from a lot of different people that can help you as a listener form your own opinions about it. And then he also, got a sense from like, how do students react to this when you tell them on the last day? Unfortunately, the camp counselors wouldn't permit him to ask students direct questions about the oil because he was there during the camp session and they hadn't gotten to that reveal yet. So he had to sort of agree to keep quiet about these things that he knew and then kind of get the reactions much later. But the reason I think, one of the reasons why this piece was so successful is that in a lot of ways, environmentalism and evangelicals are Kevin's beat, right? So he's not a trained journalist, but he has a beat, and it's the research that he has spent, a decade doing. He's not just parachuting in to like a place that is unfamiliar to him and then parachuting out and then, writing a report about it. He's very invested in these questions, central questions of how do you fund an environmental movement and what is its connection to religious studies. So he's got a solid background, and when he landed in Michigan, he was able to ask questions that really got at the heart of those things as soon as possible. He was clear about his project. He didn't roll up and record and then come home and be like, hey, I'm going to expose them in some sort of investigative journalism evil twist. He was very clear about his project. They let him come and record. We're really thankful for that. and he let them tell their stories again. So it's not objective. You can hear throughout the piece, Kevin's voice gets even, like, it just gets really skeptical. But he's like, but I asked anyway. This was really bothering me, but I asked them. And then the people respond to the question. And then, I mean, another thing that I just really love is that Kevin could have done these interviews over Zoom or over the phone with people and recorded them. And he could have written an article, or he could have written a chapter of his dissertation about what they're going through, but he actually went to go and see it. And throughout the piece is this weird, like, squishy oil well sound. And he went and recorded the oil well and recorded himself standing next to evangelical preachers saying, how do you square these things? And I think it's really impactful when you can not only, like, hear what's happening, but as a listener, paint a picture in your mind of, like, what this place must look like. It ups the stakes. And it also, I mean, to me, I am not interested at all in what evangelical environmentalists are getting up to. But Kevin made me care a lot. And a lot of that comes down to him immersing himself and then immersing us in this story. The sounds of mosquitoes at the beginning and the sounds of the oil well throughout. So I love this piece, and I hope you do too. And I'm happy to answer questions about, you know, the technical ways that he made it, if you have questions about that sort of at the end or in the chat. But Emily's gonna now share a slightly different kind of story.
Yeah, this is from a student we worked with, Jessie Marroquin. And this came out of her dissertation on the Santa Muerte, who is a Mexican folk saint and actually a really fast growing religious movement in Mexico and a lot of the Western United States. If you've seen Santa Muerte in American media, it's probably on something like Breaking Bad. She's portrayed as a narco saint, basically worshipped pretty much exclusively by drug dealers, and a way of sort of like glorifying violence and death. Jessie disagrees with that assessment pretty strongly. Her research points to a much more complicated history of the saint that actually stretches back into both medieval Catholic and also Aztec tradition. It's kind of a marriage of these two traditions that have come together in Mexico. So yeah, this came out of her dissertation research. It also ended up being a chapter in her dissertation, which was very exciting. And she let us know it's part of the reason why she was given a fellowship at the University of Chicago this year to help them think about digital media. So I'm going to play you a section of her piece. It starts out with her interviewing a member of a Santa Muerte motorcycle club who is great, but a little hard to understand, I think, due to the quality of the tape. So over Zoom. So I'm going to play a section in the middle where she goes and explores the Aztec roots of the Santa Muerte tradition. Share sound would be helpful. And as you can see, the title of this is Santa Muerte Almost There, which gives you a sense of how many drafts we often go through in a piece. All right.
It's a present. What kinds of evidence do people point to when they connect Santa Muerte with the Mexican past?
Right, that's funny that you say Mexican past, because devotees in Mexico City are literally connecting her to the Mexica, or what we call the Aztec past. So I had that same question, and I spoke to an archaeologist in Mexico City who took me to archaeological sites to show me some artifacts and see if there's a connection between that past and the Santa Muerte.
Yeah, so what did you do with the archaeologist?
Yes, so Lorena Vasquez is an archaeologist that I met at the Templo Mayor Museum that has amazing artifacts. And if you haven't been, you should absolutely go. And she walked me to this side street right next to the Zócalo. So you see all these people, hear all these noises, and she moves this piece of wood. just this plank off of this historic building. And we go up to the second story. And this place used to be an apartment building, and they discovered an enormous zompantli.
Sí, entonces buscábamos los indicadores arqueológicos para poder decir que aquí había un zompantli, ¿no?
An Aztec skull rack. This particular zompantli has about 1,000 skulls.
Debe de haber alrededor de 1,000 cráneos, ¿no? Más o menos.
And tell us what a skull rack is.
Yes, so the skull rack is where the Aztecs used to display publicly skulls of children, women, and adults.
Entonces hay muchísimos que no se ven.
We still don't know exactly why. We go based off of the descriptions of the conquistadors, or the Spaniards who arrived and described their awe.
Leyendo a los conquistadores, los cronistas.
But I'll stop there. There's much more to listen to, but yeah. So part of what makes Jessie's reporting on this so powerful, first of all, she traveled all over the place. She looked for signs of the Santa both in the US and Houston and Richmond, and also went to Mexico City, as you can hear, and got this amazing behind the scenes tour of this archaeological site. But, you know, so she talked to somebody who's an expert in the Santa and how she appears in the media. She talked to this archaeologist who's an expert in Aztec tradition, even though the link between Aztec tradition and the Santa can sometimes be a little murky. She talked to a devotee of the Santa, and that took a lot of time for her to track this person down. He ended up being very lovely and gave her a lot of time. But so you can kind of hear in the piece, if you go and listen to the whole thing, it's on the website. She's talking to a large variety of people in both English and Spanish. And then she's also doing the work here of doing translation, right? So for those that speak both languages, you can hear her subject is essentially saying something quite similar to what Jessie is saying. And that was the choice of how she decided to translate the project. But I love this piece both because it turned out like really beautifully, and I think it gives this really nuanced depiction of a saint who, at least in the US media, is like really pegged in this very small box, and also the people that follow her, right? That they are not, she is not inherently evil, they are not inherently evil, that it has this rich history, like Mexico itself, that draws both on indigenous tradition and on Catholic tradition. It's just a really wonderful piece. And I think the thing that you can kind of see a little bit, I'll share my screen again just for a second. You can see a little bit in this piece, the amount of work she put into it in terms of talking to lots of people and the number of tracks. So down here we have Papa F, that's Pope Francis, talking about the saint. Here is the guy that she talked to who's part of the motorcycle club. Here's one of her experts. Here's another. Here's some media coverage of the saint in various outlets, both in the US and Mexico. And then she's in conversation with our two hosts of the show. This is an episode of Sacred and Profane. So you can really see like this took a lot of work to put together. And just like Kevin's piece, the richness comes from the number of people she talked to and the different types of people she talked to. Kevin, I think, had a little bit of an advantage in that all those people were in the same place at the same time. And I think also what doesn't show up in Jessie's pieces, and in Kevin's too, is they talked to a lot of people who did not make the cut. So in Kevin's case, that was more students, I think also more educators. In Jessie's case, she had a whole other scene taking place in Houston with some Mexican-American devotees of the Santa that ended up just kind of being one bridge too far, maybe. It felt like we were kind of getting off the main track, so we ended up cutting the thing. But yeah, and I think the other great thing too is that this is kind of, it really is a synthesis of both documentary and thesis, and it kind of went around, right? She brought her research to this, she made this great piece, and then it became part of her thesis project, which is really awesome. Yeah, so I think in general, again, these pieces turn out so well because of what people who are working in academia can bring to a piece. You guys are on a beat already. You are deeply involved in your research, and you have a lot of connections and a lot of ideas. Yeah, and we can see that also, so Kevin went on to make another piece for us about, I mentioned it, the Hare Krishna community in West Virginia that's dealing with fracking. So he has this beat of, sort of religion and oil now. He had to do investigation into this community and what they believed. But his background and kind of already thinking about a different institution, religious institution that's grappling with the environment and oil really helped him there. And surprisingly or not, maybe not so surprisingly, we see a lot of this very similar justifications from this Hare Krishna group, subbing in Krishna for Jesus and how Krishna wants them to have the oil, and that's why he put it there. So yeah, I think just in general, these are two great examples of the real strength that having a research beat can bring to making a documentary project. Kelly, do you have any thoughts? Otherwise, we can give a few closing remarks and then we'll get on to the questions and answers.
No, I don't have any thoughts, except that another aspect of this, just to sort of return to something that I said at the beginning, as soon as we shared our screens, you saw the different sessions and all of the different clips and layers of things. And two things about that. One is that to me, and I say this in every audio workshop that I ever make, that part is either really exciting to folks or really daunting, depending on how you feel about technology and how you feel about working in a potentially new medium. But again, it is just a kind of writing. So each clip is a sentence or a sentence fragment. You move it around, you give it a different pacing, you put space in between it, like literal silence, which ends up being those hyphens that we love so much. It really is a new kind of writing. So it might look a little bit daunting or a little bit foreign to you if you've never, I don't know, recorded your own song or done anything with audio. But once you sort of get into the groove of it, it's very familiar. And then the other thing, to circle back again to the beginning, that I just want to stress is that none of this ever happens alone. So whereas my advisors were like, go write a book, we'll see you in 5 years, and I was crushed. This piece, Kevin's piece and Jesse's piece, they happened with me and Emily the whole time. We didn't come in at the end and sign off and say, that's great, or you need to do it over again. Kevin had a long meeting with us before he went to Michigan. He had a long meeting when he got back, just sort of synthesizing things and just brain dumping and saying, these are all the things I found out. It's 4 hours of story. How do I get it down to 18? He had 5 days of recording, I think. And we were there to help him out. And so these projects don't exist in a vacuum, and they're highly collaborative. And to me, that's really exciting.
And if it sounds exciting to you, we are doing another round of documentary project funding that should be, our CFP should be out this weekend. And just to give you a sense of what Jesse and Kevin and others who have gotten through the program have received from us in terms of support and what you would too, there's a $5,000 stipend that you can spend in any way you want, whether that's on equipment, paying your rent, probably not travel right now, unfortunately, until COVID's gone down a bit, but pretty much anything else. We also organize a 3-day workshop with nationally known audio producers and video producers too, because we do accept video projects. As Kelly mentioned, you get full editing support from us. We are with you every step of the way. You're published on the Religion Lab website, and some pieces are featured in our podcast, as Kevin and Jesse's were. And we also have a public audio screening where we play audio documentaries. We've done it at the Violet Crown in the past, and we can meet in person. We do it over Zoom these days, but we're hoping to feature them again in a public space, and you get free popcorn and you can bring your friends and they can listen to your pieces, and it's great. So we're happy to take any questions now about just podcast making in general, about the program itself, if you're interested in coming to join us. There are some conditions to all this, of course. We are the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, so stories about religion are kind of our jam. But yeah, we